Thank you for joining us for B'nai B'rith International's annual commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz. Since the United Nations' own adoption of this day nearly 20 years ago, B'nai B'rith has held yearly events in conjunction with that observance. We are pleased again this year to host this virtual program for a global audience and thank the B'nai B'rith World Center Jerusalem for its partnership on this program. 2024 marks 85 years since Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland and the start of World War II, which saw the full implementation of the most systematic genocide in history, annihilating 2/3 of European Jews, some 6 million of them, along with millions of others. The Holocaust was the inconceivable culmination of a nearly 2,000-year history of Jews suffering vulnerability, discrimination, and persecution in exile. This year, though, our observance of Holocaust Remembrance Day is different from all past years. Less than 4 months ago, on October 7th, a Jewish Sabbath and the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, Palestinian terrorists led by Hamas, which has controlled the Gaza Strip since 2007 and which is explicitly committed to Israel's destruction, invaded the Jewish state and perpetrated a rampage that included the murder, rape, torture, mutilation, and immolation of more than 1,200 people combined, men, women, and children, with some 250 more abducted as hostages in Gaza. Over 100 years later, a majority of those remain held in unthinkable captivity, and all too many conscripted young Israelis have lost their lives in laboring to defend their country. Nearly 250,000 Israelis remain internally displaced by attacks from two proxies of Iran, Hamas in Israel's south, and Hezbollah from its north, and many more continue to be affected and traumatized by thousands of rockets fired by those groups, along with other indiscriminate acts of terrorism. October 7th amounted to the greatest carnage among Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. Like the perpetrators of the Holocaust, those of October 7th showed that violent hatred chiefly focused on Jews does not end with Jews, not sparing non-Jewish Israelis, citizens of some 40 countries, and residents of Gaza used as human shields by the attackers. As with the Holocaust, global solidarity with the victims has been at best inconsistent, with some saying the Hamas attacks did not happen in a vacuum, and others already denying documented atrocities. One country, South Africa, has even initiated proceedings at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel, and not its attackers, of nothing less than genocide. But no doubt an array of differences remain between 12 years of Nazism and one day in October 2023. This program will explore the connections, the distinctions, and the lessons of two dark pages in the modern history of the Jewish people and our world. To moderate our discussion and introduce our speakers, here is B'nai B'rith International CEO, Dan Mariaschin.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for tuning in for this exceptionally important and timely conversation. At the outset, just after International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we pay tribute to all the victims of the Holocaust, to their liberators, and to the survivors who withstood and witnessed unimaginable horrors, including often the loss of their entire families and communities, but went on to build new lives, to contribute immeasurably to the societies in which they would take root, and to provide indispensable testimony to the greatest evils of humanity and to the perils of ignoring those forces of ignorance, prejudice, and destruction. Of course, with every passing year, there are fewer firsthand witnesses to the atrocities of Nazism. Today, 250,000 Holocaust survivors are estimated to remain among us, and roughly half of them, like half of the Jewish people overall, are concentrated in the small Jewish homeland, Israel. Hundreds of thousands of survivors found refuge and hope in newborn Israel after the Second World War, only to senselessly endure 75 or more years of war, terrorism, and hostility directed at a Jewish state seeking little more than security, equality, and peaceful relations among its neighbors. Tragically, Holocaust survivors and their family members were among the victims on October 7th. And they are among those dislocated by the ongoing attacks of Israel's enemies. We pay tribute, too, to all those who lost their lives, were taken captive or injured on and since October 7th. I'm now joined by two eminent scholars, Dr. Dina Porat and Dr. Avinoam J. Patt. Professor Dina Porat is the founding head of the Cantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry. She's served as head of the Department of Jewish History of the Rosenberg School for Jewish Studies and as incumbent of the Alfred P. Slaner Chair in Anti-Semitism and Racism, all at Tel Aviv University. From 2010 to 2021, she served as the chief historian of Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and is now its academic advisor. She's received awards for many publications, received the Raoul Wallenberg Medal for 2012, and was on the 50 leading Israeli scholars list of the Marker magazine of 2013 and on the 50 leading women in Israel list of Forbes in 2018. She serves as an expert on Israeli foreign ministry delegations to the United Nations and its conferences, and as the academic advisor of the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, now the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Avinoam J. Patt is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University and the inaugural director of the NYU Center for the Study of Antisemitism. He holds a BA in religion from Emory University and a joint PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and Modern European History from NYU. Dr. Patt previously held the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he served as the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. From 2007 to 2019, he was the Philip D. Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Hartford, where he served as director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization. He also worked previously as the Miles Lerman Applied Research Scholar for Jewish Life and Culture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's the author of multiple books, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, and co-editor of We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany. He recently completed a new book, The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt, and he is co-editor of Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust, and Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. His next book, Israel and the Holocaust, will be published by Bloomsbury Press this year. Professor Porat and Professor Patt, many thanks for joining us for this discussion today. I'd like to begin by asking each of you to speak to our essential question today. What are the commonalities and connections, but also any differences between the genocidal anti-Semitism of the Holocaust and contemporary mass violence against Israeli Jews, as now manifested most significantly on October 7th? Professor Porat, perhaps we can start with you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, the organizers of this important event. It's an annual event. It's a tradition already. Thank you for having invited me. As to your question, I think, the question and the answer to it has been going on in Israeli minds, in Israeli media, among people since October 7, because just right away, the October 7 was branded a Holocaust, a Black Shabbat, as was the name of the expulsion of the Jews in Rome during the Third Reich, a Holocaust. But I would try to define it, to define what is going on in Israeli minds in the following way. The word Holocaust and the events of the Holocaust are being again and again remembered this year or during this last month more vividly than before. At the same time, those who call this day a Holocaust Day know full well the differences, and I believe this was the beginning of your question, the differences. There are, that among the kibbutzniks in the near Gaza, in the kibbutzim near Gaza, some of them are survivors, and they were asked for their opinion. And they say, and I think what they say is exactly what the others feel, that you call it a Holocaust, but it is not. It certainly is not. Because as the survivors say. The Holocaust went on for 5.5 years, and they cost the lives of 6 million, and the tortures and the loss, and we all know. This was a day. Also, during the Holocaust, there was no state, there was no defense, there was no army. True, on October 7th, we were not ready. I can enter later, if you would like, to the basic reason of why we were not ready. We failed to defend our border and our citizens. That has to be admitted. But the army and the country and all society pulled themselves together. And within half a day, attack back began, and it continues until now. So this feeling that was typical to the Holocaust of helplessness, of being left alone in the world, of no one to defend you, was there for about half a day or a day, but not more. So what we know and what we witness is associations, constant associations to the Holocaust. People had to hide. A mother was hiding with a child. People were burnt. There are all constant use and remembrance of associations, of feelings that were there during the Holocaust, while knowing full well that this is not a Holocaust, that the differences are wide and striking. There is a discrepancy between this and that. Still, the Holocaust is being referred to, and associations are coming daily. May I, with your permission, end my response? And I'd like very much to hear what my colleague Avinoam has to say. You know that 2 days ago, there was a decision in the Department of the Ministry of Education, the Department for the Teaching of History, a decision that this year, the last class of high school will not study the Holocaust and will not have the traditional examination, a final examination about the Holocaust. And why is that? Because teachers and students and pupils, high school students said, this is far too much. This and that together, that's too much. There was quite an uproar, and now the Minister of Education is rethinking this decision because the uproar says you cannot hide under the carpet what happened. The children should, the high school student should know there is no hiding under the carpet. They should study and know what the Holocaust was, even in these days. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. Professor Patt, I welcome your perspectives.
Yes, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion with the esteemed Dina Porat. It's always an honor to converse and share the screen with Professor Porat. And I also want to say that first to thank you for organizing this program to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and how important it is that we are gathered here virtually to continue to remember the Shoah, to remember the Holocaust as we sit here nearly 80 years after the liberation, especially at a time when we know that we're living in a world with the passing of the last living eyewitnesses to the Holocaust, how important it is that we continue to do this and have events like this. Now, as to your question, which is certainly a question that I have been focused on since the events took place, and especially as Dr. Porat alluded to, the associations that have come to mind almost immediately since October 7th and the traumatic nature of October 7th, this tendency to draw associations, to compare, and we've seen this almost immediately, and debates that have arisen over, are we allowed to compare? Can we compare? In what way is it appropriate to compare? And so the first thing that I want to say about October 7th and the idea of comparing it to the Shoah is exactly as Dina suggested. For many Israelis, the traumatic nature of that day 1,200 being massacred on that day, hundreds being kidnapped and taken to Gaza, campaigns of sexual violence and perpetrated across to victims on that day, drew all sorts of associations to the Holocaust. And this should not surprise us, first of all, because of the traumatic nature of the events, which we have to bear in mind also that it's not over, right? That as we are talking about this, the trauma continues to endure, the traumatic nature of the event, the war goes on in Gaza. And so there is no closure, right? It continues. And so we have to be aware of this. I do want to point out, and someone else pointed this out to me, that if we think about the fact that 1,200 victims were murdered on October 7th, and we know that there were 6 million victims in the Shoah, then we just have to bear in mind that it would take 5,000 days like October 7th to have the totality of the 6 million victims of the Shoah. And I think it's an important and instructive comparison for us to bear in mind, because sometimes as we educate, as we think, as we try to inform our students of the totality, the enormity of the destruction of European Jewish civilization, think about 5,000 days of 1,200 victims at a time, right? And think about the traumatic nature of this day, and then multiply that out over the course of something that we could do the math would be over 13 years, right? So that's an important distinction, but important also for us to help to understand and to educate about the traumatic nature of October 7th and the enormity of the Shoah at the same time. As Dina pointed out, in another way, the associations, we have to understand that the associations, of course, not only with President Biden coming to Israel and referring to this day as the deadliest day that has confronted the Jewish people since the Second World War, or Israeli political leaders, of course, making similar associations. This shouldn't surprise us at all, because one of the things that we have seen is over the last 75 years since the creation of the State of Israel, and this is something that I write about in the book that you referenced on Israel and the Holocaust, the connection, the association, the depth of the collective memory of the Shoah over the past 75 years has only strengthened in Israeli society. Whereas in the first decades after the creation of the state, there was some emotional distance, political leadership was uncomfortable, and perhaps we can discuss this, uncomfortable with creating association between the idea that the state would have to exist only because of the Holocaust and not because the Jewish people deserved their own state, and the Jewish people had an ancestral connection to the land, and et cetera, the historic connection. There was, rightfully so, I think, a wanting to distance that the Shoah would be the only reason that the State of Israel would come into existence. And yet, over the past 75 years, for various reasons, not just political, but also reasons that deal with the prominent role of survivors in Israeli society, intensive Holocaust education efforts, the ways in which memory of the Shoah goes from one generation to the next, associations with the Holocaust have only deepened, the memory of the Holocaust have only deepened in Israeli society. And so, as Dina pointed out, it shouldn't surprise us that for many Israelis, the experiences of October 7th, combined with, as you pointed out, the genocidal anti-Semitism that was on display, the genocidal agenda of Hamas to murder any Jews and any victims that came in their way, would lead to these associations. And then the events that happened on that day, the horrible events that happened on that day of people being burned to death in their homes, of feeling powerless to confront the marauding invaders, all of the associations that we can talk about. And then, as Dina said, the words, right? So one of the things that I find striking is a lot of people who survived that day say there are no words. En milim, we hear, and there are no words. And then the words that we hear are words like Shoah, right? This day was a Shoah. Now, Shoah is a word that has both a historical connection, but also has a biblical connection to discuss and describe a day of catastrophe, a day of destruction. And this was a day of catastrophe, a day of destruction. So we have to bear in mind the significance of that. The last thing that I'll say, and perhaps we can discuss this, that I find quite striking, as someone who studies the memory of the Shoah in Israeli society and the ways in which these frameworks of memory and understanding are used to interpret events, is the ways in which we're now almost immediately seeing documentation projects modeled on projects like what the Shoah Foundation does at USC, or the Fortunat Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, or projects, Edut 710 projects that are grassroots projects to document the events using video testimony, very much modeled on the techniques and expertise that we've used to interview survivors of the Holocaust as well. So I will stop myself there, and I look forward to continuing to discuss this.
I'm struck by your reference to 5,000 days of one day. I mean, I've said to people almost from the beginning, I've said this was a glimpse. This was a glimpse into one day of 1939 to 1945, at least, not from 33 necessarily to 39, but from 39 to 45. Certainly every day, and it's an interesting way to look at it. Now, needless to say, we, members of the Jewish community and many Holocaust scholars, have long carefully guarded the memory of the Holocaust. We've been vigilant toward a public discourse in which comparisons to Nazism and the Holocaust have become more and more commonplace. What is your view of the implications of the current moment for preserving the unique place of the Holocaust in history, and also for respecting the unimaginable experience of Holocaust victims and survivors? And also, in your view, does making linkages between October 7th and Nazism obscure the line between persecution of the Jews in exile and the experience of Israelis in a sovereign Jewish state with an Israel Defense Force, which, Dina, you mentioned in your remark to the first question. So I'd like to hear from both of you. Dina, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for this next question, as well as for the first one. I would like to continue first to continue a theme that Avinoam started with, and this is what is meant when the word Shoah is used. And I would say the following, that as we know now from reading and analyzing materials, correspondence, certainly the newspapers of the time, of the late 1930s, beginning of the 40s, the word Shoah started to be used in Hebrew, not because or thanks to any formal decision. There is a committee of the Hebrew language. It is almost 100 years old now. This committee did not formally say, okay, let's call this event Shoah. It came from within. It was as if chosen by society. And why is that? Because biblically, it's a biblical expression. Because in the Bible, this expression means not only destruction and catastrophe, but a destruction that comes suddenly, that comes and you were not prepared for. It comes from afar, you couldn't see it, comes quickly, you couldn't see it, you could not prepare. So by using this word, by using it, society sort of defends itself or explains why it was not ready, why the Jews of Europe didn't see it and ran away on time. Why didn't we see the 7th of October coming? And so the word is used with this inner explanation and inner feeling. It comes from afar, it comes suddenly, you could not know, you couldn't really prepare. You could, but the word defends you from that. I think that's a point, definitely a point to remember. What you were also asking, Danny, in a way, when you said, how do you teach today, or how do you refer to the Holocaust today? I think we can also phrase the question in the following way. How can we today use the experience that was gathered along the years in commemorating the Holocaust in order to commemorate the events of 7th of October without comparing it to the Holocaust. So I would say, I would draw 2 points. Avinoam alluded to one of them. One is that there are many, many testimonies, movies, posts, clips by the hundreds and the thousands that are kept in many hands. In each kibbutz, you have someone who collects. In each city, like Sderot or Netivot or Ofakim, there is another one. And in the Moshavim. And in places, in people who were associated with the event in other ways. And the many clips, etc., taken by TV. And by newspapermen coming from abroad. Newspaper, camera, TV coming from abroad. I would say that first of all, we have to collect all of this in one hand, in one place. Otherwise, this will be all over. And we will not, in later years, even months, you will not be able to have the full picture unless all this is collected in one hand. And the National Library that now entered a magnificent new building, the National Library offered itself as a central place, and I think this should be taken up. So first of all, collect all. Second point, I made a suggestion. There are pros and cons, of course, that with all due respect to clips and all the digital means, and now you have artificial intelligence coming in and capable of doing anything. We need a physical place to which you go, like keeping one burnt house, if not in every kibbutz, then in, let's say, 5 or 6, the more badly hit, or a central one in the area. But you need a place, a physical place. People go to Auschwitz, people go to Majdanek, because a place radiates a certain power, a certain message, a strong message that you cannot get from your cell phone. It's a real place where real things happen. And therefore, I suggest that we, first of all, keep all testimonies in one hand, that's for sure. And also, we have a physical place to which you come. You have their explanations, computer, whatever, but a physical place to which people would come next. Let me end with the other part of your question about how do you teach the Holocaust now? And this refers to this debate in the Ministry of Education of the last 2 days. What do you do now vis-a-vis youth, children? They know everything. They have the cell phones, they listen, they know, they are smart, they know everything. I think you go on teaching as before. You don't change the teaching. You teach this and you teach this and you allude to what happened. You show the differences, but with the understanding that now everyone in Israel, in the Jewish people abroad, I would say, is looking with a new look at the Holocaust, with a new look, because suddenly with all these associations and with all this feeling that a pogrom did take place for half a day, you look at the events as if they refer to you more than before, as if they are closer to you as a Jew, as an Israeli, than it was during recent years. So you teach as before, but you cannot suddenly change it, teaching or facts or whatever, or lessons, but you understand and you feel that this became a more vivid part of our lives.
Thank you. Avi, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. So, so much to think about and to discuss. I want to circle back first to your first 2 questions, Dan, about let's say, the dangers of the concern about comparing, and some of the concerns that we might have that comparing can lead to a certain degree of trivialization, perhaps. So I want to return back to that, and then I also want to talk about your point about what this means about how we read Jewish history and history of powerlessness and the implications of what that means. And then I'll try to also address some of the points that Dina raised. So to your question about comparisons, and I think we have to make an important distinction, first of all, that comparing is something that we can do. And my good friend and colleague, Javi Dreyfus, made this point that comparing does not mean it's the same. Comparing is an analytical tool that we as scholars and educators can use to better understand the distinctions, the similarities between one historical event and another, to help us understand the implications of one historical event, the ways in which Jews responded, the way in which the rest of the world responded, et cetera, things that we're going to talk about. So I want to make clear, right, that we can make comparisons to try to understand the significance and the implications without creating an equivalence or saying that the two are the same. And this is important because I think one of the concerns that we have about, let's say, the politicization of Holocaust memory is that we see in a lot of different environments and spheres that sometimes politicization can lead to trivialization. So I'll give you an example, which many in our global audience will be familiar with, that during the COVID pandemic, there was a concern that many in the anti-vaxxer movement were putting on yellow stars, Jewish stars, and comparing themselves to Jewish victims during the Holocaust who were being forced, according to government edicts, to do things they didn't want to do, right? This was the comparison that was made to vaccine mandates and masking mandates, for example. Of course, I wrote very strongly against this and said that this is a horrible trivialization of the memory of the Holocaust, and this is something that we have to be very concerned about. But I point this out because at the same time, I think we have to be on guard about politicians who will use the memory of the Holocaust for certain political agendas and trivialize the memory of the Holocaust in that way. And so this is one point that I want to make. Now, the other point that I think is important in terms of understanding or comparing or using the memory of the Shoah to better understand the implications of October 7th are some of what we talked about before, which is to understand why victims, survivors had these associations, to understand the depths and the enormity of the trauma. As Dina alluded to, one of the things that's fascinating and I find very interesting as a way of comparison. So I happen to be teaching a seminar at NYU this semester on documentation collection projects and survivor testimony. And of course, documentation projects as relate to the Holocaust did not begin after the war. Documentation projects began during the war. That is that, for example, Emanuel Ringelblum in the Oynek Shabbos Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto were collecting testimonies of refugees who had come to Warsaw and were found in the ghetto, and collecting testimonies to try to understand what had happened. And this is a very interesting comparison to see the ways in which right now we are seeing all sorts of grassroots documentation projects taking place, that individuals who survived October 7th or want to try to understand what happened on October 7th are collecting and gathering all of this material to document the atrocities that took place. And this tradition that we have within Jewish history of not only Zachor, remember, but also, as was written in the DP camps, Zamot und Verzeichnen, collect and record. Collecting and recording is something that dates back in Jewish history, not only to record historical events, but also we can think of the motivations to collect and record for survivor testimony, but also documentation of crimes from a criminal prosecution component, historical documentation that takes place, the psychological components of documenting and recording in a therapeutic way, right? There's all sorts of ways. And so one of the things that I find striking, and again, to point out that we're very much in the depths of this moment, that almost immediately we are seeing this instinct to collect and record and to document. And this grows out of pre-existing modes and frameworks of Jewish understanding. To your point about sort of how this reframes or challenges our understanding of Jewish history. So I'll say that, and as I've said already, October 7th, in some senses, from an Israeli perspective, from a Jewish perspective, is still ongoing, right? We're still in the midst of, we know that we are living through a historical turning point. Sometimes in history, we know when we're living through a turning point, and right now we are in a turning point. We don't exactly know where that's going to turn, what that's going to lead to in this moment. But one thing that's clear is it has shattered, for not only for Israelis, but for Jews around the world, a sense of security. It has reinforced a sense of vulnerability. Dina alluded to some of the failures to defend citizens and residents of the state on October 7th, right? That is something that is going to have to be reckoned with and examined and studied and understood to hopefully reinforce the defenses. But on an ideological level, the notion that the state of Israel exists as a safe place for the Jewish people in the world where they can be protected, right? That has really been shaken. And one of the things that I find striking at the same time is this disconnect between the feeling that Israelis might have about what happened on October 7th and the intense disconnect between how it's been understood and perceived in the rest of the world, especially as the war in Gaza continues and has gone on. And there is an intense disconnect between how Israelis feel about what's going on and how it feels in the rest of the world. And what I will say, again, to talk about comparisons that I find striking, in a lot of the material that you see from collected by Jews living in occupied Europe during the Second World War, you do see reference to a feeling of an intense disconnection between what I might have experienced living in occupied Europe during the Second World War and the failure to understand or to grasp from the rest of the world, and a sense of alienization, a sense of a disconnect, and a sense of a loss of trust. And I think this is something that a lot of us are seeing and grappling with right now in this moment.
Well, I'd like to move, speaking of this moment, I'd like to move to an issue of the moment. I want to see if we can touch on ways in which to talk about Israel's enemies and also its harshest critics make explicit or implicit analogies between Israeli actions and that of the perpetrators of genocide like the Nazis. As was mentioned by David when we opened the program, a case has been initiated in the International Court of Justice accusing Israel and Israel alone of genocide. And last week, on the eve of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the court said that it found a basis to allow the case to proceed. What do you see as the motivations and the consequences of efforts to weaponize the genocide charge against Israel? And where do you draw the line between criticism of Israeli policy and demonization that amounts to anti-Semitism? You know, I've sometimes said, and I'm not a psychologist, but I've sometimes said that there is this kind of subliminal need, particularly in Europe, for countries who are reminded, and we remind them and should remind them all the time about their complicity in the Holocaust, that there's this kind of this subliminal need to say, well, okay, you were victims. There's kind of an agreement there. You were victims, but now you're the victimizer. And I sense there's a lot of that going on in the use of the word genocide, perpetrator of genocide against Israel. Dina, how do you feel about it?
Well, again, let me first continue Avinoam and then come to your question. But I think my answer refers to both. I think that we feel strongly that we fostered illusions. And we said at the beginning that perhaps we should say a word about why, the basic fact of why we were not ready. Not just intelligence and defense, and it was Shabbat and Simchat Torah, etc., etc. There is a basic fact that will bring me to the times of the Holocaust and to today as well. The basic fact is that we, not as an army or politicians, we as Israeli society, we fostered illusions that there might be a way to live, if not in peace, this is a big, too big, but at least to live somehow along the Hamas and the Gaza Strip and the Judea and Samaria, because they got so much money, they would care for the population with this money, as they would develop economy, etc. And what happened on this day is that a family, for instance, in Kfar Aza, in Kibbutz Kfar Aza, 5 of them, mother, father, 3 children, who were what you called a part of the peace camp, those who were driving Gaza citizens to Israeli hospitals to get free care that the kibbutz was paying for. And they planned on this day, on the 7th of October, to fly balloons of many colors with the word peace and etc., to exemplify this illusion that hit in our face. This mother and father were tied together and burned alive. The 3 children raped and killed. And this is the end of the illusions and for all of us. And it really brought back, by all this way of associations to the Holocaust, the fact the Jews deluded themselves that they would be part of society, European society, that they would be part of the building of communism and Bolshevism. They would be part of the German culture and Austrian culture. They would be trusted by France, not like Dreyfus, etc. Jews also deluded themselves that they would be part, and they would be accepted and respected, and their contribution would be acknowledged. And they were also hit in the face. What we are saying today, and this brings me to what, Dan, you were pushing more to today into the questions of how Israel is treated. Well, certainly, the same feeling that was then and is today is that the world forsakes you, that this is a Jewish state and this is why it is being treated in a way different than others. I don't have to tell you, your people who follow the news, that the Security Council of the UN, out of 100 decisions, 95 are against Israel, only some 5% go for what China is doing to the Uyghurs or the Tibet, and what is going on to the women in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, etc., etc., etc. Had it not been a Jewish state, the attitude would have been different. Where do you draw the line? Fair criticism refers to a certain case at a certain time, at a certain point. When you say, okay, I don't like the policy that was executed, that was carried out on that day, time, place, etc. But when you describe the same thing with anti-Semitic symbols and motives and expressions and accusations from the past, it is not fair criticism. It is one that is on the verge or real anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Dina. Avi, I'd like to, if I can, to kind of combine 2 questions here. One, I would like your take on what we are witnessing now, which is this reprehensible turning on its head of the word genocide, charging Israel with committing crimes of genocide, when in fact we have been the most notable and the principal victim of genocide. So if you comment on that. And the other thing also is about Holocaust survivors. We've noted that Holocaust survivors were among those killed on October 7th and among those taken hostage. The impact on survivors to have gone through this a second time, as it were, would appreciate your comments.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'll talk about your question about genocide and use of the term genocide, and I'll talk about what's really sort of the tragic thinking about survivors having to re-experience this and live in a world where this would happen, this sort of degree of anti-Jewish violence that they would experience again, right, is very sad and tragic to think about. Now, in terms of thinking about this term genocide, Dina and I, together with a number of colleagues, Tuvia Frilling and Liad Steyer-Livni and Laura Yokush, we wrote a piece together, now it's probably a couple of months ago, to refute some charges that had been lobbed, this idea of sort of beginning to accuse Israel of genocidal intent in its war in Gaza. And one of the things that we argued is that we have to be extremely careful as historians with how we use this term genocide. Genocide, as coined, let's not forget, genocide as coined by a Polish Jew, Raphael Lemkin, who lost a large part of his family in the Holocaust. Genocide as a term that is to be used as a legal category to define a crime that was unprecedented, a crime perpetrated against the Jewish people, is defined as the intent to destroy in whole or in part members of a group as such. And as we wrote in this piece, which was published in Haaretz, there is no credence to this charge levied against Israel that the war in Gaza, which, let's not forget, it's tragic, the horrors of the suffering, the loss of life, the number of people who have died in Gaza, it's horrible. It's awful that this has happened. But let's not forget that this is a response to a war that began with Hamas's invasion on October 7th, an organization that itself has stated genocidal intent in its charter to eliminate the state of Israel and to destroy the Jewish people. But because Hamas is not a state actor, because Hamas is essentially a terrorist organization governing Gaza, does not fall under the same categories in the International Court of Justice, right? So there is an inequivalency. And then at the same time, right, there is, we can demonstrate the many steps that have been taken to prevent innocent loss of life and attempts not to destroy the Palestinian people as members of the group as such, but a war that is being carried out against Hamas and the terrorist organization. So I think this is important in terms of being careful about how we use the term, because if we do overuse the term, it loses all meaning and all significance, right? And then it's just a political accusation used to malign different groups, and it's used as a charge, and it loses all its significance as a term. So I think we have to be extremely careful with how we use it. And as Dina alluded to, we also have to be very much on guard for these forms of criticism of Israel, anti-Israel sentiment that falls into traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes, that demonizes Israel as uniquely evil in the world, that uses Nazi imagery, right? Because when this happens, it's not only used as a way to use anti-Semitism to attack Israel, but it's also a form of Holocaust denial and distortion to minimize historic Jewish suffering and to trivialize the memory of the Holocaust and use as a weapon against Jews worldwide and against the state of Israel as well. And then to your last point, Dan, yes, I think, I live in Connecticut in a town, West Hartford, and a couple of weeks after October 7th, I just recall sitting in one of our synagogues where we had a community rally, a solidarity rally, a prayer gathering, and a rabbi who is a Holocaust survivor himself led the congregation in Kaddish. And it was just so tragic and sad to think about, prominent Holocaust survivor, a leader of our community who lost most of his family during the Second World War, standing here 2 weeks after, or a few days after October 7th, reciting the mourner's Kaddish, right? And thinking about, again, the fact that Jews living in a world where a genocidal organization can attempt to wipe out Jews just for being members of the Jewish people, right? And it's just one of the, of all the upsetting things, it's one of another in a long list of upsetting aspects of what we have to reckon with when we think about October 7th.
Dina, two questions for you. One is to pick up on the survivors question. Yeah. You are close to the survivor community. Would be interested in your impressions of how survivors have responded to this terrible pogrom, these attacks, massacres. And the other question relates to social media. You talked earlier about the importance of documentation, but not only documentation consolidation of documentation so that it's not all over the place. So if you would comment on social media, which does so much to advance myths and denials in less than 200 characters. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, to your first question about the survivors, this is really again a very poignant question, because as we said, you mentioned quite rightly that in this kibbutzim, especially, and the towns around them, there were survivors, and they have undergone this 7 of October atrocity, absolutely. Some of them were taken hostages. Some of them lost members of the families that they raised lovingly during the years. And they were asked. I think most of them were found and identified and interviewed. And they were asked the question that you, Dan, were asking. What do you say now? Do you have a message for us now? And yes, what they said is that indeed, most of those interviewed, that this was a most terrible day, that they lost members of the family, many of them, I don't know if most, but many of them. But still, they said, we have rebuilt our lives. After the Holocaust, when we lost everything and completely helpless, etc., and no army, no state, and no one and nothing, we were left with a shirt on our back, and that's it. We rebuilt our lives. And if we could build ourselves and our lives, all Israeli society can certainly pull itself together and fight back and rebuild what was lost. So the message is clearly there. And here I can't help but telling you the following. You perhaps know that I have written a book about a group of Avengers who tried to kill 6 million Germans after the war. It's called Nakam, published by Stanford. One of them only is alive. All the rest are gone. And he's 104 years old. He had a birthday right now. He and his wife, 100 years old, have 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 19 great-grandchildren with all the spouses. That's quite a family. He had a birthday. He got up on his feet. He's still on his feet. He hears, he's amazing. And started shouting. And he said, Hitler, I won. Listen, I won. You're dead, I'm alive. You have had no children. Look at what I did. This is my revenge. Look at the family I raised. This is, this was the feeling of survivors among many other during many other difficult times in Israel, when they were rocketing us and during the corona, etc., survivors were some kind of a model for what you can do to rebuild yourself afterwards. Regarding social media is I would say a double-edged sword, and so is artificial intelligence. It can be used, and it is used, to disseminate so much information and education and good and values, etc., etc. But on the other hand, the same means is used by those who oppose you. Anti-Semites and racists and xenophobe, etc., are using the same means very successfully. And you know better than I do that underneath the open nets like Instagram and Facebook and etc., there is the dark net. And there is the dark net that has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers, the Canon and others. They are the ones in the midst of which the assault on the Capitol was cooked and orchestrated. You have the dark net, and now you have artificial intelligence doing what it likes. Twitter, under Elon Musk, is a disaster. Is a disaster because he took off all limitations and regulations that we worked so hard to get in order to limit anti-Semitic and racist posts on the webs, and to have them limited and to have them take off these posts once you point and tell them, listen, this and it should be taken off. And now it went backwards. At least in Twitter went back terribly. So if you ask about the social nets, I think a very strong effort should be done to renew legislation and regulations that will prevent and will punish for posting constantly racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic material. It can be a blessing and it can be a big broch.
Well, we have time for one final question. And we go back to October 7th again. Avi, are there any lessons in denazification after the Holocaust, after World War II, with what will need to be done in Gaza after this war concludes? Are there any lessons in that? Are there any lessons in holding perpetrators accountable? What can we see? Are there any comparisons that can be made, or is this an all new frontier that Israel and all of us are going to have to face?
It's an excellent question. It's a fascinating question for us to wrestle with. I mean, and as you've suggested, right, are there things that we can learn from the situation in post-war Germany to apply to the present day is the right way, I think, to frame it in terms of our trying to understand what we can learn from history to apply to the present. The first thing that I'll say, and I'll respond to your question, and then I do want to briefly respond to some of Dina's points about social media that I think are quite important as well. I'll say that one of the things that's interesting and that I've alluded to is that we're dealing with a fundamentally different situation in the point that we have an international system that is prepared to deal with sovereign nation-state actors who are believed to operate with a degree of responsibility to their citizens and to their people living on their land. And as Dina mentioned before, this was one of the fundamental miscalculations in terms of Israel's approach to Hamas ruling Gaza, and this belief that perhaps their radical genocidal ideology would be moderated to a certain extent by the responsibility of governing this territory. If that was a calculation, this will have to be one of the things that is wrestled with. And I would point this out because you ask about denazification in post-war Germany. And one of the critical components that we can learn from the process of denazification in post-war Germany is, first of all, that it was highly incentivized for, the Allies highly incentivized the creation through the Marshall Plan of a West Germany that would re-enter sort of the Western Alliance, would grow its economy, would build a flourishing democracy. And so we have a different situation, I think. We'll have to see what unfolds. Right now, a lot of it, we also had 4 different, occupying armies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, who partitioned Germany in the aftermath of the war, who occupied for several years. We'll see what the post-war situation is like in Gaza. There's no way to predict what that's going to look like, but there's a number of ways in which I think the post-war situation is going to be very, very different, which is going to make a denazification sort of parallel very difficult to implement in post-war Gaza. But we'll see. We can't predict the future in this regard. I do want to mention something that I think is quite fascinating about Dina's point that alludes to this idea of revenge and resilience, as she pointed out with the survivors. And the book, just to give a plug for Dina's book, Nakam, on the Avengers, really is an incredible, fascinating story about this group of Avengers led by Abba Kovner, who were committed to pulling off a mass revenge plan that never, ever happened, that didn't take place. There was a small, and Dina writes about this brilliantly. But what's fascinating is this question of what is actually revenge? What constitutes revenge? And revenge is a deeply emotional state, a deeply emotional desire that is completely understandable, especially after World War II or in the aftermath of October 7th. But as Dina points out, I think extremely helpfully, both in the book, David Ben-Gurion, in the aftermath of the Second World War, said, there would be no revenge that would be justifiable if it wouldn't bring back 6 million Jews. And if there's no revenge that brings back 6 million Jews, I'm not interested in hearing about it. Dina, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But instead, the appropriate revenge would be to create the state of Israel and to create a free, functioning, secure democracy in Israel that could protect the Jewish people, right? That would be the most appropriate revenge. And so I'm really struck by this thinking in a longer term sense of, what would constitute revenge, right? What would be the appropriate way? What would it mean for Israel? What would it mean for survivors going generations forward? The idea of having children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that being the appropriate revenge to Hitler, and what we can learn from that we might apply from the lessons of the survivors to our current moment in terms of thinking about it. And I have a lot also to say about social media and denial and distortion, which we're all extremely concerned about. I'll just say in one brief statement that one of the things that we must be doing, and this is the role that education has to play, we have to train our young people, we have to train our students just to be critical thinkers. There are so few reliable sources of information where they are getting the news of the day, where they're getting their information. They have to have media literacy, digital media literacy, social media literacy, not believe everything they hear, not believe everything they see on TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, but check their sources. If we can just teach them to think critically, which is what we're trying to do in our classes, at least we'll have begun some of the work to hopefully correct some of the horrible wrongs that have taken place with this age of not information, but the age of misinformation and disinformation that we're living in.
Thank you, Avi. Before we close, Dina, final word?
Okay. Well, 2 final sentences. One is, Avinoam, you were right in saying that this sense of not full, we always had troubles and wars, etc., but of security, of living in Israel, has been shaken recently. We are all astonished to see that since October 7, October, November, December, January, each month, some thousands of Jews immigrate, make aliyah to Israel. This is crazy. Kinderlach, a war is going on. Perhaps you wait a bit. No, they are coming by the thousands. Yesterday evening, me and my husband came back from Italy from being with the Jewish community there. We come to Lod airport with newcomers, all excited to come. And how was the welcome? Hamas rocketed the area while we were in the airport. And they are coming. So I would say that this is really a sign of hope and of a future. Revenge, we don't want revenge. And this is not, if the Bible says an eye for an eye, we don't want an eye for an eye. No one is going to rape. No one is going to burn. We want another situation. The revenge would be rebuilding what was lost and having Gaza and its people, government, I would say there are thoughts about it internally by themselves, and having the Middle East perhaps a bit better with alliances of the Emirates, Saudi, etc., with the United States, have a stability and rebuilding that I think all this area deserves. And the final word, A lot comes out of ignorance about Judaism, about the Jewish people, about Israel. There is rampant ignorance. There is also rampant ignorance among young Israelis regarding what is Islam and what is Christianity. Indeed, if there would be an attempt to study about one another, to know more about one another, perhaps we can hope for another world.
Well, Professor Porat, Professor Patt, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you very, very much at this extremely difficult moment as we're living through the events in real time for your insights, your expertise, and for all you do in the critical realm of educating about anti-Semitism in general and the Holocaust in particular. I'd like to thank the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem and the B'nai B'rith Office of UN Affairs, as well as all of our colleagues, for making this important discussion possible. And thank you for joining us today. This program will remain viewable on B'nai B'rith's social media channels. Please consider sharing it, follow us on social media, and visit b'naibrith.org to find ways to get involved and support our work in Israel, at the United Nations, and around the globe. As always, B'nai B'rith will remain dedicated to preserving the memory and the lessons of the Shoah and of anti-Semitism historically and today. Thank you for joining us in this essential task.